Goedemorgen iedereen. Mijn naam is Stefanie Galula.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the Master of Ceremony of today. I am very happy to be here today. And I would like to present to you a very ambitious plan along with our Minister, Zakia Khattabi. And I'm very proud as well to present to you Mr. George Gilles. He is also present here today. The plan that is going to be presented to you today via the minister who is dealing with the Green Deal and Sustainable Development, Zakia Khattabi. So this plan that is going to be presented to you is a plan that is going to respond, or that is responding to a certain number of questions that we all have in our environment. It is very urgent for us to give an answer to a certain number of questions with regard to climate change and society change, and there are still a certain number of questions that need to be answered, namely to transpose a certain number of those policies in the daily life of the European citizens. When we are dealing with the floods, for instance, that took place in Belgium not so very long time ago, we also know that the most important people, that the people that have been finally especially dealing or having to deal with this were people who were underprivileged, poor people as well, persons and people that are being impacted by everything that relates to transition, more specifically women as well. And when we take a look, for instance, at the situation and the analysis that we made of these events, we also know that there are a series of solutions that have not really been looked into by the previous politicians, but it is very urgent for us to do this now, and this is also the reason why we would like to present this plan to you today, and also to exchange with you and to exchange with the members of the civil society. And it is really an honor for us to be able to welcome a certain number of people here today, Mr. Delmagne, and also a certain number of other people who are going to talk to you about the fact that this is really a global policy, and it is indeed a policy that is going to have to involve many of our politicians in the different parts of our country. We are also very happy to welcome a certain number of very eminent professors, and some of them are going to give us a certain number of solutions in several fields, such as economy, social affairs, environment, but first and foremost, I would also like to tell you that I would like to welcome you and to thank you for being here, because these are questions that we all have to deal with. What is now a just transition? What does it mean to create a future for each and every single one of us, not only for Belgium, but also for Europe and for the entire world? What does it mean to have a common future? And this is what we are going to talk about today with our minister, Mrs. Zakia Khattabi. You have the floor.
Et pour ceux qui l'ignoreraient, durant toute...
And for those who wouldn't know it, during the entire presentation you have on your seats translation equipment, headsets for you to listen to the translation of the various presentations. So there are a number of interventions, and after those interventions we also will have moments of exchange with the various speakers. The minister who will present us her goals with regard to the just transition policy, and finally we will have a moment of exchange with the public, and afterwards you are all cordially invited to lunch. Thank you very much.
Merci Stéphanie. Alors bonjour à toutes et à tous, je suis très heureuse de vous voir.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to see you all here, and I'm also pleased with the reactions that we received since we announced this initiative. And so this really shows how important the stakes are with regard to the topic today that is being discussed in Davos. And Davos, these are not very environmental people, but take into account this topic, and this is also a very historic moment. And this shows you that collectively we can together contribute to developing a socially and environmentally correct policy. So, dear guests, I would like to start with an adage that is at the center of our policy. This means that governing is also to predict. The environmental urgency calls us upon developing a change socially and economically, and the anticipation of these changes encourage me, and all the various industries are all involved in the goals with regard to carbon neutrality that we set ourselves on the European level and the world level. So all the industries will have to transform fundamentally, also on the social level. So our economies have to be going through a ecologic, environmental correction. So there is today a social consensus to recognize the climate urgency and also to recognize the necessity to change course. It is now time to come together in order to launch the necessary transformation necessary to answer the challenge of the century. And this necessary transformation will only take place through a democratization of the public debate and will be only considered as legitimate and fair in its efforts through these discussions. And this is why we have opted for a just transition, and we organized this convention, or État Généraux, in order to start this collective deliberation, democratic deliberation, with regard to the options that we have to decide upon that would allow us to construct, to build this future on the social and equal and environmental level. The idea of just transition was promoted since the beginning of the 1990s through the leader Tony Matsuki. This means that the number of economic activities will have to be restructured fundamentally. So millions of workers will run the risk to be impacted by this transition through a low-carbon economy. But this ecologic transition is also a source of new employment, of economic diversification, reconversion, and also has a potential to achieve social justice. And so this link between social justice and the environment leads me to insist on the fact that this struggle against climate change is being inscribed in a broader framework of sustainable development linked to the sustainable development goals. So various goals like the struggle against poverty, inequality, equal opportunities are goals that have to be addressed at the same time. So this means that the reduction of greenhouse gases cannot be considered outside of or opposite to the struggle against inequality and poverty. This is why I wanted to broaden the original understanding of just a transition to the most vulnerable layers of our society. So it is up to us to plan from today on the policies that are necessary in order to address these two goals, the environmental protection and social protection. In order for them to be able to reinforce each other, we have to develop strategies on the mid and the long term which are global and coherent. And this is why this stake is very important today, because otherwise we would run the risk of losing control of this movement. So it is up to us to work collectively to address these issues where social justice and ecological or environmental justice go hand to hand in order to move to a more sustainable world. I wish you a very fruitful and agreeable morning. Thank you very much.
Merci Madame la Ministre pour cette introduction et merci.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Minister.
Young, you know, I was about 6 or 7. My grandma used to say, when you do something alone, you go fast. But when we do something collectively with someone else together, we go further. And that's exactly what we were trying to do today, this morning, sorry, I'm a little bit confused, I didn't sleep a lot. So that's exactly in that spirit that this conference today has been organized by Minister Khattabi's team and us today. And to go further, when I was in my introduction, I also talk about the fact that it's not only about Belgium today, but it's a global measure that it's installed today. And on that matter, more specifically, Mr. Jan Timmermans, the Vice President van, yes, Frans Timmermans, sorry. Frans Timmermans, the Vice President van the European Commission, could not be here today with us, but he made sure to deliver a little message for us. And he played a specific role when it comes to the environment and how to tackle the matter of climate change. He put in place, more specifically, the Green Deal when it comes to European vision. And he's about to explain us a little bit more in this intervention right now. Could you go ahead? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to address you today. And let me first say how happy I am that you have organized this national level conference on a just transition. Fairness and solidarity are at the heart of our green transition. It will be just or it just will not be. All politics, left, center, or right, is ultimately about redistribution. It's about two things: who pays what and who gets what. The biggest redistribution question of this century is related to how we tackle the climate crisis and the looming ecocide. In itself, the transition to climate neutrality is already a policy towards more justice. Think about it. If we don't act, who will suffer the most from the droughts, the floods, or cold houses because of high energy prices and our reliance on imported fossil fuels? It's the people who are already struggling today, not the rich. If we manage it well, if we follow through, the European Green Deal will create durable local jobs. It will reduce pollution, make our air more breathable, and our cities more livable for everyone. Of course, this transition is a disruption, like any transition is. In the short term, some will be affected more than others. But I'm deeply convinced that the sooner we act, the better we can manage the impact on people and on places. Waiting reduces our ability to decide ourselves which path we want to take, as choices will be forced upon us by others. Since the 24th of February and Russia's unjustified invasion of Ukraine, we need to move with even greater ambition than before. Renewables and energy savings are the only lasting way to cut our dependence on Russian fossil fuels and ensure energy sovereignty. In this light, I applaud Belgium's decision to allocate 50% of the recovery plan to climate action and to already speed up your energy transition. Your plans to advance investments in hydrogen and biomethane, eliminate barriers to renewables on land, and reduce VAT on heat pumps and solar show others the way to go. The expected action plan on green skills in construction and plans to strengthen renovation obligations will likewise be of huge importance. In this endeavour, the EU wants to be your partner. We aim to provide clear policies and support to convert old and polluting activities to sustainable business models. The European Union Innovation Fund is a good example and an important funding source for breakthrough decarbonisation technologies. We also want to help you organise a transition in a just way. Our climate proposals for 2030 include a social climate fund to allow vulnerable households and micro-enterprises to invest in energy-saving technologies. The fund would offer these groups in Belgium nearly €2 billion for insulation, for solar panels, for heat pumps and clean mobility. It helps reduce emissions and it helps reduce energy bills. The Social Climate Fund will therefore make a big contribution to ending energy poverty, also in Belgium. Before I end, let me add a word on workers, because we need them in this transition. We need them desperately. We need to train and reskill more people to install solar panels, to renovate buildings, to build batteries for electric cars, to produce green hydrogen, etc., etc. The green transition brings new jobs. Last year alone, renewables added more jobs than fossil fuels. So let's make sure people have the skills to fill those jobs. In sum, to have a just transition, we need to act fast, involve everyone, and provide additional support to the most vulnerable. We have what we need to make our green and digital transition a real success story. Thank you for your efforts towards writing this story. You can count on me to support you. And now, let's all get to work.
So, thank you to all of you once again. And I'm really pleased to call our next speaker, Professor Jan Rotman. Is een
He teaches at the University of Rotterdam, and he has published more than 20 books on sustainable change and climate change. We are very pleased to have him among us. Would you be prepared to join me up front? Thank you very much.
Wil je hier blijven?
Ja, ik blijf hier dan wel. Ja. Ik kan hem zo bedienen, hè?
En jij heeft de tijd ook.
Ja. Dames en heren, goedemorgen. Met uw welnemen doe ik het in het Nederlands.
So I'm going to give my speech in Dutch because I understand that there is a simultaneous translation. I am a professor specialized in transition. This is something that I have been dealing with for 25 years already. And in fact, transition is always leading to inequality on a social and an economic level. And but I do think that it is possible for us to change this. I would also like to talk to you about my last book with the title Omarm de Chaos. So I hope it's not my last book. I don't think so anyway. I hope that you're going to be able to follow the presentation with me and that everything works well technically. After 37 years on research and climate change, I do try to stay optimistic. I always start with this one. We do not live in an era of change, but in a change of air. And this is maybe also something that I would like to tell to you today, because lots of people are asking themselves a lot of questions, and we are all part of a revolution today. It is a major transition, a major revolution that is comparable to that of the 19th century, because then we had the industrial revolution, now we have the digital and the sustainable revolution. For years, things were really difficult. Populism was rising, and today, I think, during many years, the situation is going to be difficult as well, because each major transition is going to go hand in hand with chaos. But it all worked out in the end, and I think that this is also something that we will have to prepare. It will not be easy, though, and in times of chaos, you have people constructing a certain number of things, but also destructing things. And Stef Bos one day wrote a letter or wrote a song and said everything that disappears is going to make place for something new. And finally, we need what we call a ministry of destruction instead of construction. It is maybe something that we should have in the Netherlands and in Belgium as well, because there are a lot of laws and regulation that are avoiding this. But if we take a look at the enterprises and the companies that have difficulties today, in recent years there are 6 energy companies that went bankrupt in the Netherlands, but also in the European Union. Shell was steady as a rock one day. I worked together with Shell to make sure that there is sustainable development in that company as well. But do we still have the time? That is the question that we should ask ourselves. Look at what is growing now, what is being constructed. Philips, for instance, it has become a care company now. We have digital companies. ISML started as a startup, and it is now bigger than Philips. So construction and destruction. People don't like chaos, but I am a lost expert, and experts like chaos. The ancient Greeks also talked about the birth or the genesis of a new era, and this is indeed also the way that I see it, until the moment when change came about, and then environment needs to follow as well. But chaos in fact means that everything is possible, that we are now in a situation where there is no balance anymore, no equilibrium, and this is of course something that we will have to deal with it. And let us then try tomorrow also to celebrate chaos. It means that we are very close to the core of transition. This also means that there are many solutions that might come about that we didn't really see before. So COVID helped us to do this more quickly, and the climate change crisis is maybe also going to do this. So we are going to solve things, and we are going to do it in a way that we don't know anything about just now yet. But COVID was difficult for us, but it also had a direct and indirect effect on raw materials and energy. We see now that the energy prices are going up, and the demand increased considerably. Container transport takes much longer, has become much more expensive. It was already difficult with everything, with the prices of steel and so on and so forth, and it's only the beginning. There is also an explosive demand for solar panels in Belgium and in the Netherlands. People want to invest in better insulation and so on, and that is beautiful. Only when you order them today, it takes 6 months before you get them, because there are transformers that need certain chips, and those chips come from China. And I'm going to show you a scary picture a little bit later in my presentation. I'm going to show you how dependent we are going to become on China in the coming years. And those who know me also know that I will also try to anticipate. Everybody is talking about energy transition, and my perspective is that in 10 years' time we are all going to talk about the raw materials transition, and for that we will have to call upon China. I am promising this to you today already. It's going to be very exciting. The Ukraine war is a humanitarian disaster, but it's also a wake-up call for energy transition. You know that we, the Dutch, we like to have commerce and trade with other countries, and indeed it was difficult for us to make some decisions a few years ago. We trade in everything. Let's take a look at the port of Amsterdam and Schiphol, and we said we are now going to trade in gas, but where does it have to come to or from? It's going to come from Russia. So let's make sure that we get it transported here into Western Europe, and of that entire idea nothing really was realized because we all became dependent on Russian gas. That was the consequence of it. So we want to make sure that we are no longer depending on Russian gas in 2 years. That is impossible. I can tell you that already, ladies and gentlemen. We do have to make the necessary efforts, but it is not going to happen in 2 years' time. I have a lot of contacts with many people in the farmer sector, with many farmers, and they will have to depend on that gas for some years to come. It is not simple, of course. What happens today is typical of a transition. In the short run we are going to have to call upon petrol, coal and so on, and this is going to lead to more CO2. It is even going to increase in the coming 5 years throughout the world and throughout Europe. But the sustainable development is also going to be accelerated, and the only way to be independent of Putin and China is to become more autonomous and to invest in renewable energy, wind, solar energy and hydrogen. And I'm going to come back to that later on. When I started, there was one pillar with regard to energy transition, and that was a major reasons to start doing this and launching this. And we started with it 30 years ago. Lots of youngsters think young people think that we only started now, but we already started 30 years ago. There are two pillars that are very important: life security and geopolitics, because it is true that everything is going to deal with dependence and independence on energy. It has become more complicated, and it is not as simple as what people might think, but this is something that I would like to show you here today. You're maybe not going to sleep when you think of this tonight, but take a look at what is the threat that we are confronted with. In the coming years, we are depending on Russia as far as gas is concerned. Take a look at solar energy, electrical cars and so on. We need lithium, we need a certain number of raw materials that sound like drugs, but they are all in your mobile phones, in your solar panels and so on. China is controlling 90% of that market, has half of it itself, and the rest is in Africa. And in Europe, we stocked them in the coal mines that we closed. Do you know, ladies and gentlemen, where most of the critical metals of Europe are located? In the eastern part of the Ukraine. And that is not really a coincidence, is it? Because it is what the war is also about. And everybody is talking about green hydrogen, and that is also something that is necessary for the industry. And do you know where we are going to get this? From desert countries, as we call them, because we can manufacture more than half of it. You need a lot of space, you need a lot of wind, a lot of solar energy, and then we depend on Morocco, Qatar, Libya, Tunisia, the Middle East. Is that not something that we could have foreseen? A few years ago, I was in Uganda, and I saw lots of Chinese people there. They are constructing a whole infrastructure there, and I entered there, and I saw people from China, from Uganda. The Minister of Foreign Affairs called me and asked me whether we were not supposed to conduct a raw materials policy. And I said, you are a little bit late because China has been doing this for 30 years already. In Europe, there is hardly any raw materials policy, neither in Belgium, neither in the Netherlands. I hope that you woke up or that you will wake up shortly. There are more and more conflicts about energy and raw materials. That is something that is important for the success of the energy transition. And social justice, economic justice, how can we make sure that we don't see these kind of figures or pictures in the future is something that is not going to be avoided. Revolution will be there from certain groups of the population because of a certain number of aspects such as discrimination, mass immigration, climate change, and so on and so forth. This report was published in 2022 on climate change. And I have to think of the first report of the IPCC 32 years ago, where I gave my cooperation to. It was basically the same message, really, because we are going to change the climate on Earth, and this is also going to have an impact on the most vulnerable population groups first. We thought that this was going to change the world, but the report didn't change the world, of course, alas. But the message is, of course, radical. We thought that we were okay here in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and in Germany. Look at what happened in July. I have developed one of the projects in Maastricht, and we we made a certain number of efforts in order to avoid floods and so on, and we thought that it would never happen, but it happened in July. It is now once every 10 years that we can be confronted with this kind of situation. So this means that we will have to make sure that we undertake some actions to avoid this as well, around the rivers as well. And this could be my daughter, ladies and gentlemen. But it's not my daughter, fortunately. I went to see, or I saw this, and I said, okay, this is a statement, and she said, you don't have to take it literally. Yes, of course not, but it's a message, of course, in terms of climate change. And she said, your generation is the one that made things the way they are today, and that was very painful because I was the first one in the Netherlands who had a master with regard to sustainable development, climate change. The climate model that I developed is the one that is being used in many negotiations. And it is true that it is part of our responsibility, but we're doing and we're trying to do something about it now for our children and our grandchildren. We all have a role to play in this. I had a bicycle accident and I became an activist because I had to revalidate during a year and go to a rehabilitation center because I couldn't walk anymore, and I had the time to think and to reflect on all this, and I became an activist, and I said I have to share my knowledge with the society. And I created this club, and I said, yeah, there are already a lot of clubs. You shouldn't do that. And I said, I'm going to do it because if there are many, why wouldn't I have my own? And together with some other people, some other experts, we created this club, and we have been existing for 15 years now. We've done very beautiful things. There has also been a judicial action that we started against the Dutch state, the Dutch authorities. It was also something that was followed in Belgium, and there are many lawsuits now, I think about 2000. It's not all about the same thing, but it has given a lot of people a lot of inspiration, and that is exactly what we need today. Roger Cox is also a lawyer that who you see here on that picture. He also had a lawsuit against Shell. He won it as well, and now he has a list of 40 multinationals that he is whom he is asking to do something about everything that relates to climate change. If not, he is going to intend a lawsuit against them as well. So he's one of the most influential people in the world. In times of chaos, people can make the difference. Each company can now be asked to give explanations in front of court. And this is something that is important as well, because nature is important. We think that we can destruct it and damage it, and then nature is going to come to us, climate change or a virus or whatever. When I started, we were very worried about nature. Now we are less worried about nature. Nature is always going to survive. That is something that you hear often. We now worry about a human being. Does the human being have sufficient capacities to face all this? Ladies and gentlemen, I think it is very simple. In my last book, I tried to analyze a whole bunch of solutions. Energy policy, it starts here and it ends with us, with the human being. We are very selfish, in fact, and we always want more and more. And the last report also indicated it very clearly. If we really change our behavior, then we can also reduce 40 to 70% of the CO2 emissions. That is not something that is easy, of course, because we always want to say that it is someone else's fault, capitalism, economy, and so on and so forth. But it is us as well, because we're also very selfish, and that is the most uncomfortable message of this morning session. What we expect, ladies and gentlemen, is a wave of crises. The COVID crisis led to economic recession. COVID as well was in fact an inequality issue. The most vulnerable people were very often touched and impacted. It is not part of the climate change, but maybe it is as well, and it is going to become manifest in the coming years as well. And then biodiversity as well. That is also something, because if we continue to destroy nature, we are going to destroy everything that is very important to us, namely water, food, and so on and so forth. And last year there was a study, there was a survey on the economic impact of climate crisis compared to COVID, and the result of it was that you had twice as much economic damage, 4.5% a year, and this during a period of 30 years. So I said, okay, I'm going to Twitter that, but nobody reacted to it. And I said, one crisis at a time, maybe. And now I'm going to talk to you about something new in my story, namely the reason to be very optimistic, ladies and gentlemen, because we don't like to learn something new. We don't want to change, especially not when there is a professor from the Netherlands asking us to. We are certainly going to learn during crises, when things are really difficult. Then we can do things that we never did before. In times of Corona and COVID, we worked online. We made decisions very quickly about bureaucratic matters. We accelerated a certain number of changes. With the next crisis, we are going to do that as well. After each crisis, we see a pattern. 5 to 10% of the people change their behavior. And the others say, okay, we're going to go to Bali again with a plane. And at a certain moment, this is no longer possible, ladies and gentlemen. When quarter of the people are going to change their behavior, things will change. And this has been proven by people such as myself, but also sociologists, for instance, from different parts of the world. So If 1/4 of the population is changing his behavior, the rest will follow quickly. And in the Netherlands, about a quarter of the people have solar panels now. I think you were there before us in this sector. It took about 30 years, and I think that in the upcoming 10 years, this is going to be multiplied by 4 or 5. That is what I am going to talk to you about, and this is something that that is important, because transition, that means really three things: change fundamentally, or reflect and act and organize yourself fundamentally differently. And in science, that is embedded. This is not something that you can separate, but I tried to do it, and what is most difficult is thinking in another manner and thinking differently. And I can give you some insights on the basis on what you might think about a certain number of things. And in my last book, I also described 10 transitions. And what do I see when I take a look at transition? You already know everything with regard to energy, raw materials, circular economy, but you might not know the pictures that you see on the other part of the slide, namely transition in education, make sure that children think differently, transition in care as well, because care is unbalanced, transition also in democracy, that is the mother of all transitions, and it is maybe the most difficult one because it is still in the very early stages of the transition that we need today. And for those who think that it is going to be calmer in the coming years, well, I can tell you that that might be the case, but there are three buttons that you can turn. And yesterday, in fact, I tried to quote them differently. It's a little bit like a chaos on this slide, but there are three things that we can do. Fiscally, financially, and legally. We already do a certain number of things, and we do not have to say that nothing happened, because thanks to climate change, we are already presenting figures that are lower, minus 1.52%. Technology is important, but transition is more important than technology alone. And behavior is also very important, because it is something that is not very often talked about, because we can talk about the CO2 emissions that need to be reduced, but things are going to be done differently than you might know. It is going to be done because we shift our social standards. Had I been here 40 years ago, I think that 90% of the people were smoking then, and had I been here 40 years ago, 90% of the people were smoking. You were social when you were smoking. Heroes were smoking. This is no longer the case. After 50 years, if you smoke, you're not really appreciated. I don't know who's smoking in this room, but I can tell you my mother was pregnant with me when she smoked, and my son said, lots of things went wrong. That is maybe the case, but when you are pregnant and you are smoking, that is not something that is being acceptable. Our social standards changed. A very small part of the population stopped smoking, heard that smoking led to pulmonary cancer, and those people, that 5 to 10%, also influenced the rest, and now you have the result of today. And it's the same thing with climate change. It's about social standards. Social standards are really monitoring all this. And that is also a lesson for everything with regard to food. Eating meat, for instance. There was an article that was published by me lately. I said, if in 10 years' time you are still going to eat such a fast food hamburger, then you're not doing well. And I had a lot of very negative reactions, but it's the case. Then on the other hand, there are other aspects as well that we never heard of 10 years ago and that we think are acceptable today. It will no longer be the case in 10 years. If you still don't have solar panels on your roof in 10 years' time, well, then this is not acceptable. What do I mean when I talk about facing the chaos? we need to make sure that we learn to face that complexity. We should not try to control it or monitor it, because if you try to control it, it's not going to work. Take a look at the COVID crisis. We also tried to control the crisis, and it only had a contrary effect. You have to learn to live with the impact, and this is something that you should also convert in scenarios and strategy. This is very important. In fact, I'm going to talk to you about it very shortly. You see that there are a certain number of things that we know, the facts. They are not going to be discussed in those times of chaos.
De wetenschappers België.
Even though every year hundreds of scientists gather and claim that the Earth is flat, so they developed equipment to show this, to demonstrate this, but they always fail. But this was a little joke aside. So facts are facts. You have white spots. Those are the things we know we don't know. So how did the coronavirus start? What is its origin? So let's start above, left-hand side above. So the blind spots, and then we have the black swans, the 9/11. So this was something that apparently came out of the blue. But now, today, the blind spots are the most important things. So the things we know we don't know. So we knew that a pandemic will arrive. We didn't know when and how. So it was taken up in every security and safety strategy. We thought the impact would, the chance was so small, but the impact was gigantic. So the events with a small probability and high impact are being ignored, and so we know that the climate crisis is at hand, and despite of this, we ignore it. So, in other words, I have to think about Professor Oosterhuis when I worked for the IVM in the Netherlands. 30 years ago, he worked on viruses day and night, and I asked him, "What are you doing there?" He told me, "Jan, there will be a pandemic one time, and I will be on the television screen every day." So we had Mr. Oosterhuis, you had Mr. Van Ranst here. So they were all right. So we didn't listen to them. We didn't hear their message. So we ignored the knowledge that exists. In other words, what can we expect? If we continue as such, we would have COVID-25 because the new pandemic will originate somewhere in intensive animal husbandry, perhaps in the Netherlands. And so we also thought that the internet cannot stop for 3 months, and the students said no, that would not be possible because we will not be able to work. So, and it can happen that internet stays down for 3 months. We don't want to imagine it. So, geopolitical war, a year of extreme drought. These are things that has happened. Do you think it is a coincidence that this year is one of the driest years ever? So I have developed a image of the future with a number of designers and architects to try and see how the Netherlands will evolve within 100 years. So I've done this for the Netherlands. So this is what awaits us in the Netherlands, and this could happen also in Belgium. So I would like to tell you, watch this video and see what will happen in the Netherlands. So most of the Netherlands is about 7 to 10 meters below the sea level, and there you see we have allowed water to invade our land. We will live on the water, next to water. So you see that the water is taking up a lot of space. Agriculture has been reduced by a half. We will create more green, more forest, more wood. We will use that as a raw material to buy houses. We will go to the north, and we will keep the Wadden Islands. We will use the sea to generate energy through wind, solar, hydrogen. And you see all the ships will then navigate along routes through the North Pole because there was no ice anymore. We will allow the water to flood a number of areas behind the dunes. We will have the construction of new delta works where we work with nature and not against nature. So incorporate nature within the development of our country. So this has generated a lot of controversy in the Netherlands. So will my property be submerged or not? So this is not the intention, but suppose that this is the image of the future. Are we prepared for that? And the answer is no. So we have looked at the time we would need to we needed to realize these plans in the past. So with regard to the rivers, it took us 20 years to deepen the rivers like the Maas. And we also have the delta work. So if we want to invest in the future projects, you see that we need 50, 60, 70, 80 years in order to finalize those projects. A North Sea wind farm takes eight years to develop. So in other words, we have to start these projects within 10 years. So let's move on to the most fascinating part, so the just transition. First of all, we have the framing. When we talk about climate, we mainly look at technological answers. Do we need the nuclear energy or not, green hydrogen or not? This is all important, but you have to take into account the social redistribution. As long as we continue to this technological framing, we will not be able to solve the social question. So what do transitions of the past show? So every transition leads to inequality, social inequality, economic inequality, per definition, within countries, among countries, and we see that the Industrial Revolution mainly impacted the lower classes. And now the middle classes will be impacted. This is the mitigation report of the United Nations that was published a couple of months ago, presenting all sorts of possible solutions and measures. And this was all drawn up in the light of inequality. And this is the first time that this was put on the agenda by scientists. So the main conclusions, firstly for the world and then for Europe. First, climate change mainly impacts the most weak, the vulnerable, mainly in Africa, South Asia, Central and South America, the island states. Extreme weather contributes to humanitarian crisis. This is the first time that we established this humanitarian crisis will be made worse by extreme weather. And now today it also impacts people 50 times more in more vulnerable areas. And the conclusions for Europe are also interesting. So Southern Europe and the Mediterranean area are the most vulnerable. So 30 years ago, I gave a presentation to our then Queen Beatrix. We developed the European climate model, and we have shown that in the future in Spain and France and Italy it would be so dry and warm that the tourists will go from Spain to the Netherlands. Everyone laughed at me, said this was unthinkable, and in the meantime not anymore. So large swaths of the Spain are confronted with extreme drought, extreme heat, and this makes that agriculture has become impossible there, and 1/3 of the Southern European population will suffer water shortages. And also the coast and delta areas are very vulnerable in Belgium and the Netherlands. What are we going to do about it in the Belgium? So, but I miss that deep sense of urgency in your reaction. So in the 19th century, We had the Industrial Revolution. Now we have the digital revolution. We were afraid of the mechanization. We would produce en masse. This would lead to massive unemployment, and the poor and the unqualified will suffer. And this is so the period that Marx warned us for. And now we have a Piketty. We have a great deal of demonstrable social inequality, and there are a lot of trouble. So how did we fix it at the time? It is very interesting. We developed laws and rules to protect the poor and the vulnerable. Secondly, unions were created in order to protect workers. Housing corporations were created to provide a payable, affordable housing. We have equalized the social subclass via education, and a number of civilian initiatives were developed in order to defend the rights of those layers. So you see this after every crisis, and you see this here over the last 20 years. You have an explosive increase of citizen corporations all over Europe, and this has been part of the commons involving about 1 billion people. They don't shout out as loud as populists, but they are constructing and building a new society in all silence. And you also have an increasing evolution. And we also had at the time big powerful companies, the big powerful steel, coal and railroad companies that were split up. So laws were voted to break the power of these companies. We have to do that again against the big oil companies and also the big tech companies. So what is a just transition? You could say first you would need just social economic development, environmentally just society, in order to reestablish defend biodiversity and also democratic equity. So socio-economic equity or justice. And you can also apply this to Belgium. So the energetic transition needs a lot of investment. So hundreds of billions in the Netherlands for the coming 50 years or so. Who will pay this, do you think? And not one politician dares to give that message. You and I are going to pay the bill for this. 10 years ago, I told people you are going to pay 2 to 3 times more for your energy bill. Not one politician dares to say this, because the message is not easy to accept. It's not the companies or the authorities who will pay this. We are going to pay this through our taxes. We have to be honest. We will have a big return, but at the beginning, it will ask a lot of us. So energy poverty is a growing problem. 7% of Dutch households have had problems with regard to their energy bill. A lot of companies will disappear. The metal industry, fossil energies, chemistry, the agricultural sector. Big agriculture will also disappear, but the new economy will generate a lot of new jobs. And in Europe, we think that in 2030, 30% of the jobs will be produced by the new economy. So I don't worry too much about this. People from working in the fossil industry will be trained to work in the new economy, to install solar panels and so forth. But the thing that worries me is the disappearance of administrative jobs, accountants and so forth. So in the 19th century, the subclass, the lower classes were impacted. In this transition, the middle classes will be impacted. So what is ecological justice and environmental justice? So the air quality is becoming a bigger problem. And you see that poorer, vulnerable people live on average have a 7-year shorter life on average than people in which are richer. So how do you see this? So you have a number of neighborhoods in the big cities where you have poor neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods, and there's only 5 kilometers dividing them. So, and you will see that that will cause problems. And what is a democratic justice? So up to now, this was a top-down process. So the citizens didn't have much to say about this. So we are asking ourselves, why is there so great resistance against the established, against the authorities? So imagine that. So do we have to install a more bottom-up process? So we started this at the end of the 90s in 2000. During 5 years, we developed hundreds of experiments, involved a lot of people, and then the companies intervened, like Shell. The Shell decided, okay, we will set up a steering committee and we will steer this all. And I told them, not too fast, Jan. It will not be in the interest of Shell to do this, to take this movement over. I believe that we waited too long to involve citizens, and this makes that there is a great threat of social upheaval. Revolution. So, and this is a real threat. So, what are the possible solutions? To conclude, there is no panacea, there are no simple quick fixes, but let's think about solutions. So, first of all, a compensation fund. Frans Timmermans also mentioned this. It is necessary, but not sufficient. We have to compensate the vulnerable. But let's be very intelligent in organizing this. So, if we want to do away with natural gas, insulating the houses of poor people will be a very efficient measure. So you have double gain, so better housing and cheaper energy bills. Fiscal policies, I believe that we will tax more and more wastage and pollution. So we will introduce a fly tax. We will also tax cars. We will tax sugar and meat, and this will also be done at the expense of low income. So you need an intelligent redistribution via the tax system. So in fact, you have to make flying 10 to 15 times more expensive. So so people who are going or are leaving or are going on holidays one time a year, that will not impact them too greatly. But those who are taking the plane every week, that will be a great impact. Then legislation. We have to develop legislation to protect the vulnerable. We also have to develop legislation in order to split up the very powerful parties, companies. And it's years now that I'm pleading for a transition law that would also temporarily annul existing laws, because on average you need 7 to 8 years to implement a new legislation. There's a lot of literature about that. You can read up on that. And then also a education offensive, training offensive. People who are laid off will have to be accompanied and helped to a new job. In the coming years, we will have a shortage of installers. Up to 100,000 people will need to be trained to fill those jobs. We have to reschool the workers. You have to train installers, roof workers. We have to provide retraining for a great number of workers, and then you also have to involve citizens. There's a lot of cynicism that has been created within the citizens. We have to develop new forms of participation. We have to set up citizen councils, which are a very useful instrument, but a useful tool, but you don't have to expect too much about this, because they develop a lot of radical proposals that are being then, well, diminished, if you like, once it enters the political quit. In Scotland, we saw the creation of a Just Transition Commission, a type of council where unions, the environmental movement, companies and scientists met, and they went to towns and cities to contact people, to reach out to people, and this worked good. So, and the thing that amazes me is, why don't we take over the good examples that are being developed in the other countries? Why don't we try to implement this in our companies? So this is very strange to say. So when I started my transition research, I told that the political world will be the last to join the change. So the political system is more based on status quo. But we are now arrived at a time where the political world also has to move, often has to take the initiative. But we have to also take this up from the basis, from the companies, from the citizens. The small and middle-sized companies also have to act. We have to be positive. We have to frame it positive. There has never been one transition that has been effectuated on the basis of pessimism. So I'm convinced that we will succeed in this. It will be extremely difficult. It will be extremely lengthy, but we will succeed. You can only succeed if you have a positive framing. And leadership is of the utmost importance. So in a period of chaos, you need leadership which is authentic and which connects people. So I was a great supporter of Angela Merkel, who said we are schaffen das. So you also need a personal transition, individual transition, in order to overcome your fears. A lot of people fear a change, and you have to help people overcome their fears, and I'm very happy that I can help a lot of people to overcome these fears and to engage in that transition. And want to conclude with these magical words that were spoken more than 110 years ago by Theodore Roosevelt. I would like to ask you to read this text. They are very actual. It says, okay, join the arena, try it, do something. It is not the critic who counts. The honor comes to the man who effectively goes and does something in the arena, who is working hard, who tries to reach something, who has a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of dedication, who invests completely in the case and gives more. And if it goes well, will finally taste the triumph. But if he doesn't succeed, he will be the man who has shown the greatest of courage. Thank you very much.
Hartelijk bedankt, professor Hotmans, voor zijn hele mooie speech en presentatie voor iedereen. So, to think, to manage, and to organize. This is one of the things that you told us in your speech, as well as the Minister Khattabi said earlier. Gouverner, c'est prévoir. And the idea of a just transition is not only an idea, it's not only a concept, it's already a reality, close to us actually. In Spain, Spain has been facing a lot of social economical struggles for quite some time now, but it decided not to make any choice between the social well-being of the people of Spain and the economy. Therefore, they decided to implement intersectional policies in their way of governing when it comes to Spain. And we are about to see and hear and learn a little bit more about that with our next speaker. Unfortunately, the Minister, Teresa Ribera, is not here today with us, but she kindly enough leave us a small message. So Teresa Ribera is the Vice President of the Spanish government, and she's also the Minister of Ecology and Transition, and also demographic challenges when it comes to Spain. She's also a member of the social parties when it comes to Spain, the PSEO. And she will explain now how she managed to implement the just transition into Spain when it comes to more specific policies, also on a national plan, and also on the more common plan when it comes to energy and climate change.
It is a real honor to be part of this very important launch. I would like to congratulate the Belgian government, the Belgian society, and very much in particular Minister Khattabi for this very important initiative. Our countries, our governments, our societies share a lot of interests, a lot of goals for the time to come. It is not easy to decarbonize our energy system, to facilitate a new model without paying attention to the transitional effects that it can have in our society, workers, regions, or consumers. It is clear that the overall benefits are much more important than the effects that we may be going through during the transition times. But we cannot forget about the very important effect on individuals that this transition may have. We want a society that it is fair, that shares the benefits, that shares the cost in a fair manner. This is why we need to count on transformative, fair, cohesive, and very participative plans. How we can organize this transformation, ensuring that everybody feels they have a role to play. Participation is absolutely key. I think that the territorial cohesion is obvious, but territorial cohesion means people that want to be part of the design of their future. This is why we need to ensure that there are the adequate channels to facilitate this participation and to promote and to back the initiatives that come from the bottom up to the top. We in Spain decided to dedicate a whole chapter to the just transition in the national energy and climate plans. We thought that it was very important to share our views on how to define the goals and how to define the pathways, so to ensure that everybody had an opportunity to discuss, to contribute, and to be part of the final agreement. The Just Transition Strategy is a key piece of the National Energy and Climate Plan. Why? Because we wanted to ensure that the workers, the neighbors, the cities, everybody willing to do something, including the local entrepreneurs, had an opportunity to express why and how, and to have a reference so to ensure that there are some means, including social measures, to facilitate that this can happen. We started with the coal regions, the coal mining and the coal thermal plants that needed to be phased out. We started to work with the representatives of the workers, the unions, but also with the local mayors and the local citizens and associations to facilitate the identification of the concrete plans, the potential ideas that have been identified by the players on the territory, on the ground, when understanding what could be the add value of their ideas compared to whatever other circumstance that may come or may be created from abroad. This allows us to promote the just transition agreements, so to define the territory, the ideas, the means, and the capacities and deadlines to organize the transformation. In terms of governance, we needed to create a new institute, a new reference in the administration, in the state administration, so to coordinate the different initiatives, but also to ensure how we can access to the different funds coming from the European Union or coming from the national budget, so to be sure that whatever initiative may come up and should be sound, should be sufficiently strong, could count on the support of the different budgetary means. The companies operating the coal mines, or operating the coal plants, together with the trade unions and with the representatives of the government, so my ministry, myself, or my Secretary of State, did sign an agreement to facilitate the transformation and accepting different engagements, different commitments that could be the main references to undertake the different measures. This provides a comprehensive action plan for each of the regions being affected. The results are very interesting. Almost 800 different players did contribute to the design of these regional territorial agreements. The purposes, the ideas, the lines to take were very different, but many of them were similar or at least consistent. Skilling and reskilling, incentives, so for new entrepreneurs to take additional action, involvement of the traditional utilities or the traditional operators in the new incoming activities or even investments in this same context, counting on these traditional operators, and a full involvement of the local authorities. There were some important duties also. The full restoration of the lands being affected by the mining, the possibility to count on small and medium enterprise to develop their own activities in an umbrella package that could facilitate their new investments, the possibility of the municipalities being partners in these developments, and the capacity to assess that whatever initiatives could be backed by the national budget should be consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals and in general terms with a sustainable growth model. Today, 4 years later, almost 90% of our coal capacity is over, and it has not been easy, and the work is not fully achieved. We still need to do many things, and sometimes it is very difficult to face this transformation, such an intense transformation on something that represents so many important values in these regions, for these families, for decades, with such a big contribution for the development and the prosperity of the country, come along with no apparent capacity to come back in a very short period of time. Sometimes it is difficult to keep the emotions, for instance, when the big towers from the coal central plants come down. I want to pay a special tribute not only to the workers and the families of the workers that have been contributed for this prosperity for decades, but also to the mayors and local authorities. It is not easy to be part of this adventure, and sometimes it is difficult to be there, supporting the neighbors, supporting the conviction that even if it is sad, it is even worse that the youth leaves the small town because there is no opportunities. So investment since the very beginning, it's a very important thing to ensure that there are new opportunities in the same local areas. We thought that it was important that initiatives in the just transition areas could be covered by the National Recovery Plan, the post-COVID plan, because it is also an important piece of the cohesion and the ecological and energy transition that we need to address. At the same time, we know that this is part of what we have felt we needed to introduce in our national regulation. The climate change law establishes the need to count on these just transition plans and to review and assess their impact at least every 5 years. But as I said, this is not only about coal workers, it is also about consumers. And this is very important in this point in time where we see that some energy companies are making big profits even if cost or demand or offer have not changed. This is why we need to pay attention to what it represents for the consumers. We need to ensure that consumers do back this transformation and do experience since the very beginning the benefits of this transformation. This is part of counting on an energy model that it is much more distributed, much more democratized, but not only. The price are also an important piece of this regulation. Taking into consideration how the vulnerable groups of the society could be facing difficulties in covering their expenses, their energy cost every month, we need to be sure that there are special dedicated funds to facilitate the access to energy to these families, these households. I wish you the best success in this new adventure, paying attention to the opportunities, so to make them bigger and more numerous, and paying attention to the difficulties, challenges, barriers, and very much in particular the social adverse effects that we may be facing without paying attention, without realizing, because in fact this is an adventure to win we all, not only some people.
Thank you so much. Zo, nu de kabinetchef van de minister Khattabi zal de plan...
Now the cabinet chief of Minister Khattabi is going to present the plan to us. I give you the floor.
Dames en heren, goedemorgen.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of my minister, Mrs. Zakia Khattabi, I have the pleasure to present you the policy with regard to just transition. In fact, everything is going to be organized around four very important elements, namely with regard to you and me as a citizen, the most vulnerable people in our society, on the other hand also the scientific world and those who also deliver the facts and figures, and then also a certain number of societal stakeholders, as we say. And our aim, our goal is to make sure that we develop a very large societal dialogue, because transition or a just transition will only be possible when we make this debate a democratic debate. I'm going to explain this slide to you. You see that we have four pillars, in fact. And in fact, this means that we are undertaking 4 initiatives to make people work in this field. And we take a look at the second column, that is more in particular the High Committee. And we're going to take a look at the scientists, of course. We're going to say something about this later on. We're going to ask them what that means, what a just transition means for Belgium. Science-based is in fact also a characteristic of the policy of Minister Khattabi. And then the second element is in fact agora. It is in fact a term that we know especially in the French-speaking part of the country. We are going to indeed engage citizens in this policy, take a look at the priorities in our society. And then there is a third pillar as well. It is a forum. And this is in fact a forum where we are going to ask the stakeholders to develop a memorandum as well in this respect. And then there is a fourth pillar as well, and that is also quite important. That is the fact that we are also going to ask the contribution of the administrations. We have an interdepartmental committee for sustainable development, and they are also going to give us their knowledge and their expertise in this very interesting debate. And the whole has to lead us to a national conference, and it needs to be the input as well for a national conference with regard to just transition. Allow me to take a look at the following slide now. And this is in fact something that I should do myself if I understood it correctly. So you have the whole picture here. We already talked about it in the opening speech of the minister. In fact, this is a kind of general state with regard to just transition. And I already talked to you about the different pillars, but this is supposed to lead to what has been taken up in the governmental declaration of this government in spring 2023. We need the organization of a national conference with regard to just transition. And the ambition of Mrs. Khattabi is to do the following during the Belgian presidency of the European Union, the second half of 2024. We would like to give our input, and we would like to launch an international conference with regard to just transition. And that presidency is also something that we will use in this respect, of course. But today we are here to create what we call the High Committee for Just Transition. And this is something that we want to do today. And the minister is drawing the attention to a science-based policy, the importance of scientific knowledge for policy. Because we indeed see that on a daily basis people try to ignore scientific facts to make to discredit them really in certain cases, and this is not something that we can do. Professor Rotman's already talked about this to us. We cannot ignore reality, and this means that we need to face the challenges, and it also means that there is a very diverse knowledge of scientists, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary as well. That is the way that we need to tackle this. We need a certain number of insights that leave that allow us and that encourage us to look for a solution altogether, and to face those challenges. And that high committee, you already see the composition of that high committee, which are the different disciplines that are going to have to participate in this high committee. You see them on the slides. And that high committee, under the co-presidency of Professor Zakia Khattabi, University of Antwerp, and Professor Marcudon of the ULB, Université Libre de Belgique. As you see it, Dutch and French men, women, a committee of experts, indeed, whom we're going to ask to cooperate around a certain number of missions. And the minister asks, or explicitly asks, to draw up a report and to have it ready for spring 2023 around that question, namely, how can we make sure that there is a just transition in Belgium that can be installed and it can be implemented. Of course, the classical content is also going to be necessary with regard to definitions, for instance, namely, who are the priority groups in our society, leave no one behind. That is also important. The challenges as well that we all face, the obstacles as well that we face. How can we now also monitor this? How can we make sure that there is progress that is being made in this respect? And which are the recommendations for the policymakers? And then secondly, the interaction with the stakeholders. That is also something that is important. We also want to publish it. It is, of course, another report that is going to disappear in a drawer. The results should also be shown and published. And then on the timeline as well, the fact that we have to make sure that this agenda on an international level is also being made public. And I think Mrs. Cantillon and Mr. Marek, that I can give the floor to you now in order to reflect on this furthermore. Thank you.
Ja, dankjewel.
Thank you so much. We already heard many different things. And I'm not the first one who has that technical problem with the microphone, apparently. Anyway, we heard a lot of things already today, and I think that we don't have to repeat ourselves. That is certainly not the aim. First and foremost, I would like to say that when Mrs. Khattabi invited me to come and talk to you today, well, then I didn't hesitate very long, because the previous speakers already clearly said it to you. You do not have to doubt when you can contribute to the major social questions in our era. And I prepared a certain number of slides, but I'm going to go very quickly because I would certainly like to say something about the last slide, really. Certain number of slides to underline again what is quite important, namely the fact that climate transition is in fact a social matter. It is a social matter first and foremost because the contribution to the emissions is unequally divided between people and countries on an international level. And then secondly as well, not everyone is being impacted in the same way in the field of climate change, and then the expenses of or the cost of policy is also unequally divided. I'd like to show you a certain number of pictures. Contribution to emissions. I guess that the public in this room knows what we are dealing with. We know that unequal repartition and division throughout the world, and then also the fact that this is the same thing within the countries. The contribution is bigger with higher incomes than with lower incomes. So the responsibilities are also different between the different countries. The consequences of climate change, we already talked about it just before. We do not have to make a drawing, do we? Because we all recall the images of last summer, nearly with the floods in Belgium and in the Netherlands, in Germany. It was very visible how socially unequal this impact of the floods can be in this case. And here on an international level as well, there is in fact my town on your right hand side of the slide. That is in fact the air quality in function of the income of the citizens. There is a very strong correlation. If the income is low, the living circumstances are less good. And then I would like to come back, and how can I do this? Okay, I found it. Okay, the cost of the climate transition. I am very happy that poverty scientists who have analyzed this situation, and I also am a part of that. Well, in recent years, in the last 10 years, we also analyzed the theme of climate transition, and we also looked into the impact of policy. And in fact, we do not have to make a drawing. The impact of policy is, of course, something that is going to be bigger when we take a look at the people who have a lower income. And what is especially very important, and that is also something that I can add to the debate if you allow me to, that is the fact that transition, climate transition, and the consequences of the climate change as a systemic program, and you also indicated it very clearly to us, well, that this is something that is coming on top of a poverty problem that is also a systemic solution, as you may know. This graph is showing you the evolution of poverty defined according to the European poverty limit. You have to have an income that is lower than 60% of the average income in certain countries, in Belgium, in Finland, in the Netherlands, throughout a very long period, and we go back to the beginning of the 90s. This shows you, in fact, the evolution of the poverty percentage with the population, the active population, namely people who are retired. The impact of retirement has been put between brackets here. So, in fact, we are going to look at the people who are part of the active population, working population, and their children as well. And then you see this growing tendency in all those countries, major differences as well, because Denmark is doing better than Belgium. Denmark is indeed a better care state than Belgium, but all of those countries show you an increase over a longer period. We are talking about the period of 30 years, and that tendency goes back to the 80s, and this is a very, very long period of 40 years indeed. And during that period of 40 years, poverty with the working population is progressively and steadily increasing. and there is not one single country who succeeded in stopping that tendency. So these are movements in the conjuncture of a society, and we didn't succeed in changing this. So this means that there is a systemic problem, and it also means that turning back the clock, turning back those evolutions in that tendency asks or requires more than just a little bit policy here and there. So this means that we know more, or that we need more than making the present-day policy instruments better than in the past. So in the optimism of the previous speaker, and I have to thank you for your presentation, colleague Rotmans, I think that we need to continue being very optimistic, because it's true that we need to be optimistic, because we have for instance, the fact that there are smaller initiatives, bottom-up initiatives that are being generated. We also call that social innovation. Here and there we see that those are initiatives that are being taken as an answer to a systemic problem that we cannot seem that we are not able to solve. And then there is Europe as well, and I'm very happy to see that our first speaker today was Frans Timmermans, and in previous years indeed Europe showed us the way, for instance with the European pillar for everything that relates to social rights, and this is indeed also an instrument or a tool that can really be very helpful to us. And then if we view it in this way, climate transition is finally also something that requires some optimism, because this tendency, these movements, and this is really one of my convictions, it is the climate transition that will allow us to make people think differently. And I don't have the answers either. I don't know how I have to return this tendency. I think that we need to go deeper in this reflection, and climate transition is certainly going to help us doing so. And I am sure that with the wonderful committee that you have been creating, that we will be able to contribute to this. Thank you so much, and I give the floor immediately to Marak. We didn't really know each other. I think that we saw each other once online. It's the very first time that we see each other, and it's really working between us. Good, great.
Voilà. Bonjour à tous. C'est un plaisir d'être avec vous.
So good morning, everyone. It is really a pleasure to be here with you and taking the floor after the very enlightening presentations. Thank you very much for the exchanges we had. It was an honor to work with someone who has such an experience with regard to social security and poverty. So it's a great joy to make the link with the Bears presentation. When we looked at the StatBel data, more than 2,100,000 people in Belgium are running the risk of social exclusion. Without a compensation, financial compensation, we would have 27% of the Belgian population who would be in a situation of social distress. And I don't want to submerge you with figures. We have had a number of figures and data this year, but the last report of the IPCC tells us that we are approaching the limits of planetary sustainability, and these two data sets show us that both themes, both issues are intimately linked, and so next to the environmental approach and next to the environmental question that has to be addressed, we also have to address the social dimension. I wanted to talk to you about three things, three necessities and one promise. and a promise that we would like to make collectively with this committee. So we have three necessities. The first necessity is the necessity of synthesis. We have this high committee because today there's a need to develop a synthesis, a summary. We're talking about just transition since this morning, but there are a number of various definitions with regard to what is this just transition. So we have to frame this, we have to understand the differences between those definitions, and these definitions are linked to various approaches of just transition. This is something that we have to be aware of. So today there is an interest. This is one of the tasks of the High Committee, like Bernard Mazin had presented this, to make a synthesis of this, a summary, to define this, to explain this, in order to develop a conceptualization elements about what this just transition is specifically. So we're talking about just transition, but there's also a necessity to make the link with other concepts that we have talked about, the SDGs. In Bologna, we talk about SDGs in companies. Another concept that is very important in the question of just transition is the environmental justice. And then you also have the donut theory. I believe that it is important today, during the workings of this High Committee, to understand better what the just transition is and to establish the link between them, to see where we have overlaps, where we are not talking about the same thing, and to see how this debate on just transition can also allow us to make progress in other debates, in other perspectives which are important. Second necessity is a necessity of coherence. So we still have the tendency today, we have talked about a lot of systematic things today, but we now have the tendency to work in silos. We have the environmental pillar, environmental political, social pillar, social policies, digital pillar, digital policies. So we have various different transitions, and working like this is suboptimal because it is not efficient. Because when we want to go faster in our decarbonization policy, we would need if we develop one policy for the various social layers, this will not be efficient. Studies show this. And finally, if we have separate debates, separate reflections, we will have a rebound effect. And this means that what we will gain on the one hand, we will lose on the other hand. So, for instance, with digital policy, if digital policies are being instituted without making reference to the environmental and social questions, this would also be suboptimal. So we need to go further. We know that the shift towards the new jobs, so the renewable industry, the renewable energy industry will create new jobs, will have an interesting economic impact. But we also know that in some cases we will have conflicts between the objectives of social justice to reorganize our society and the environmental objectives as such. So the first element, and this is also something that we will try to establish in the report in the High Committee, to identify these conflicts between social justice policy and environmental policy. So therefore, we need to set up a redistribution policy. So we're talking about compensation funds. So first identify to compensate. After this also means that there will be a cost involved. A second reason why we need to have some coherence, this is, so Bayer talked about social innovation. In a broader framework, we will have a number of innovations on a number of environmental fields on the microeconomic levels, organization of companies. We also need to set up to encourage innovation, which will mean hope for the future. So why is there a problem of coherence? Because sometimes these innovations will not be very coherent or consistent with regard to a core activity of an organization or the policies of the company. So we will be talking about niches without having an impact on the system. So what is the impact of all this? Why am I talking about this? Because today, with regard to the inconsistencies, the incoherence, this will lead to misunderstandings that the public, citizens, consumers, and so forth will not understand this, and this will then lead sometimes to demotivation. We see this more and more being documented in the companies, the demotivation at work, the corollary also with regard to the question of meaning, and this demotivation can lead to revolts. We have seen a number of pictures during the presentation of Jan Rockmans of revolts, upheavals, the yellow vests, for instance, in France. It is very complicated. So this accumulation, this incomprehension, demotivation, revolt, and fragilizes our institutions. And this is why we also work on governance in its multiple aspects, public governance, enterprise governments, and just transition will then also evolve to a new way of governance in all types of organization, all organizations. This is the third necessity I wanted to address. This is the question of governance as such. So we are gathered here together to launch a dynamic, and I believe that we have succeeded in this with a great deal of enthusiasm. So we are very pleased, and looking at the list of our colleagues who will make up this team, we have a very broad range of competencies and specialities. So we have various different disciplines, complementary disciplines, people working on legal issues, fiscal issues, mobility, social economy, climate, sociology, constitutional rights and so forth. So we have a very broad range of specialities, and the importance of this diversity is we will all start from our own disciplines when we are talking about just transition in order to achieve something that is meaningful. I believe that our ambition is really to form a very knitted team, and our second promise is we will not reinvent the wheel. This is not our intention. A lot of things exist, a lot of work inspires us. I could have given you 3 slides of references with regard to all the topics that would interest us, but I would like to show you a handful of reports to show you that we are aware of this. So you had the report about sustainability and poverty developed by the committee for struggle against the fight against poverty and social inclusion. On the Walloon level, we have also a number of reports being issued with regard to just transition in Europe, and then also very broad scientific literature on the just transition and civil society. So a lot of things are being published, and this morning we also had a report published by the Climate Coalition, and also a very important interaction with social society. A second promise, finally, is to try to draw lessons of what we have seen these last months. And I would like to underline one of the reports that was a great source of inspiration for me, about the people who have become invisible during COVID times, and this shows that we have the tendency to work around averages. So what did this report tell us after having analyzed a lot of the topics with a lot of focus groups with the most vulnerable people? So we have the tendency to set up policies for the average Belgian, person. So one of the lessons that have been drawn is instead of starting from the averages, let's start with the margins, with the extremes. And once we develop a policy based on the situation of the people at the extremes, we will achieve often a policy that suits all Belgium. So we have to address those people who have become invisible in our society in order to work with those the most vulnerable of our people. So often when you develop policies based on the average situation of Belgium, you often forget those people at the extremes of poverty, and you will not have a very a policy that is being broadly carried. And then finally, a double promise. We have to mix all types of expertise and fields. So this is the promise of the interdisciplinary makeup of our team. So it takes more time to have a multidisciplinary approach to develop something interesting. A second promise is to work directly with these intermediary institutions, with the associations, companies, unions. It is a report of a scientific committee, but it is important that there's a link being established with the reality being lived by all those parties. So it is important that we take into account the reality of the people involved. Thank you very much.
Voilà. Un tout grand merci pour ces deux dernières interventions.
Thank you so much for those last interventions. We now come to the last part of the presentations of this very interesting day, Just Transition. And we would now like to give you the floor. It is now the Q&A session. I would like to ask our Minister to come and sit here next to me and the two other speakers as well. And for those who are following us on the internet, you can also send your questions to us, and we will also group them and respond them later.
Voilà, donc encore une fois, merci.
Well, thank you so much. My first question, in fact, is for you, Mrs. Minister. I would like to know when drawing up this or setting up this committee, because it is a very important work that you did along with your cabinet, and it is the result of a lot of research as well. In your viewpoint, what does our country need as far as the structural organization is concerned in order to help us to set up a global just transition? Well, as you already told us, we would like to thank the team that is behind the organization of this seminar. It is in fact the Department Just Transition of my cabinet, Veronique Anaïs Mates, and the political vision is that of transversality. This is very important within our cabinet because we're not working alone. We are working together with other parts of society, other stakeholders as well, and I would like to thank them for all the work that they already did for us, in order for us to come to this end result. And indeed, I think that for all of the questions that have been asked to us on an environmental level as well, it is important to know what we need to do. First and foremost, there are a certain number of answers that will have to be given as well to some of the questions. The enterprises, the companies will have to provide us with a certain number of answers as well. And one of the most important problems is exactly the fact that we need to work together today. that is very important for us today. And there is a colleague who is trying to reduce the CO2 emissions. And indeed, this is something that we will have to do. The status quo is, of course, important, but we also need to evolve. And governance is really one of the most important elements. We need to come to a coherent approach. And this is also the first remark that we can make, because indeed, when there is an analysis that is supposed to be made of the energy and climate plan, the first remark that we got was that it is not an integrated, embedded vision. It is something that requires a cooperation. And I am convinced of the fact that the simple fact of integrating our visions will allow us to become more efficient as well in the future. And this is also something that we try to do within the cabinet. And my competence, climate competence, is of course also linked to this. This is something that will require the establishment of a roadmap in order to make sure that we can work on decarbonation, and that there is also an objective of reporting a certain number of activities to see whether or not the direction that we are heading into is the right one, and with a public discussion also on that report. And this is in fact that we would like to do, because it is very often something that is ignored, that people don't always know, whereas indeed it can be a very important lever as well, when environmental and social evolution is concerned. Okay, second question is for Bea Cantillon. How can we make sure that the social transition is not going to increase the inequality between population groups? I already told you just before that I don't always have the answers. I think that I have been reflecting for more than 40 years on social policy, poverty, and the most important lesson that I have been drawing is that our social security and our social welfare is indeed very strong in order to make sure that poverty is not evolving, so that our society becomes more equal. It has also been a success story, but meanwhile, and that is also the reason for which I showed you the graph as well, we are heading into the wrong direction, and this is the case for many years already. And this means that there is something else going on than only the inefficiency of policy here and there, or certain tools that have been developed, and this means that, and it is in fact a little bit like climate transition as well, we know, and we all know what we need to do, but in order to convert this in a program that is good for the government's kind of political menu for the minister, that is another story yet. So this is a very complex question, really, that we need to ask ourselves, and it is indeed something that only going to prove itself by doing a certain number of things. It is a little bit like the genesis of our social security. It took about 200 years. It started somewhere in the 19th century, and it seemed to function after a while. More and more groups were finding a connection with that policy, and on the basis of a major social pact, the social security became an obligation for each and every single one of us. And that was really the success story, and it is something that was also developed at the basis, at the core of our society. We are not going to invent the wheel. We are going to see what is going to function. Some things will function, others will not function. And I think that what is important, and I hope that we are going to be able to do this with our committee as well, the goal is to make sure that we take a look at the situation as it evolves and that we see what works and what does not work, what we can develop and what we cannot develop. So that is in fact what we need to do. I do not believe that we need major inventions, ladies and gentlemen. I don't think that it really works like that. So I think that the answer to your question is in fact a progressive evolution, taking a look at what works, what doesn't work. And I repeat once more, it is not something that we're going to do alone. Not in Belgium either. We are going to do this on an international level and outside our borders, of course, to make sure that we can realize this and implement this. And this is going to learn us something, but maybe not enough to be able to undertake the next step. Okay, thank you. Marek, a question for you. In your viewpoint, what is the economic model that needs to be developed to respond to social and environmental issues and problems without being dependent on a model of economic growth alone? I hope that you have a whole afternoon to listen to what I have to say. Well, indeed, it is a very large and ambitious question. It's about economic models, and I think that there are going to be similarities, but it is also an economic global model that is going to allow us to develop our actions with the society as a whole, with the companies. And one of the major challenges of social innovation in the economic environment is indeed the way in which economy is going to not integrate what we can finally prove on an environmental and social level. And indeed, this is of course a difficulty that we have to face. And the problem today is to find a model that is going to allow the companies involved in just transition to continue to develop themselves and to have the opportunity really to also impact the regime as a whole. And this is really one of the major challenges that we are confronted with today, namely to know how we are going to find a system that is going to allow us to function so that all those external elements are much more taken into account, so that when we have a service offer, that this is reflecting especially the impact of or on the chain or the value chain level. And that is one of the most important elements. This is something that we can convert in the economic models of tomorrow as well, and that is also going to allow us to face all those different issues and matters. Maybe there are some reactions, observations, findings, questions in the room. Anybody have a question? We can... Yeah, apparently there are questions in the room. It is a very intersectional approach, so we are going to allow you to take the floor. Men and women. Is there a woman who wants to take the floor with the microphone, please? And you all have a microphone in your seats. I don't know if you know that, because if you don't use a microphone, then the interpreters cannot interpret.
Bonjour, donc moi, vous m'entendez je pense. Hein. Donc je suis Karine Thibault, je suis porte-parole de Greenpeace, mais je pense que je vais prendre la parole. On l'a évoqué.
Yes, we already talked about it. I think we published a white paper this morning, and as Greenpeace, as an organization that is a part of the climate coalition, we are very happy to see indeed that this just transition policy is now there. It is that association between climate and society and economy, and it can allow us to do a lot with regard to decarbonation. And I would like to ask a question to the Minister. That process is for us complementary to another process that is being developed, that is the National Energy Climate Plan. We have already been criticized by the European Commission on our capacity to develop policies that are going to take into account a just transition and so on and so forth. So it is very important for us to know how we are going to come to a specific chapter on just transition. It is indeed something that you have been talking about, and it is necessary for us to have a transversal policy so that we can indeed do something about that situation in which people are all reflecting on this issue in their own corner without any cooperation. And this is indeed what we need to do. It's transition, just transition, investments as well, also for energy transition. Both need to be linked as well, and then the means as well. Within the Vivaldi government, are there some initiatives that are being taken so that we can proactively reflect upon all those different matters? Thank you.
D'oublier. Alors je vais réagir tout de suite. D'abord, par rapport
well, next to the initiative that we have undertaken, the collective debate that will be launched, there is also, in the framework of the reflection with regard to the federal measures that have been taken, another system that is going to be developed, namely that of the klimaattafels, the climate tables. And the idea indeed is to know how the citizen is going to be able to discuss about the most acceptable measures so that we have the guarantee that they will be implemented concretely. So this is also important. And in the framework of the National Climate Committee, and Matthias is also sitting in this room at the back of the room, there are also a certain number of proposals that are going to be debated, and this is important for the entire government, but it hasn't yet been implemented. So I am not despairing, but I would like to say that we would like to be able to work together on that as well with regard to competences within the different governments. It is true that very often I hear people say that there is a lack of integration, and on the same in the same context, I know that this is in fact a behavior that is not mine. So let's all work together, make sure that there is an integrated policy, and all the stakeholders around the table are, of course, also working in that direction. And then the Commission also made a decision already, because on the budget level there are some decisions that have to be made very recently. So we have to make sure that we don't leave a debt for the coming generations, younger generations, and we have to make sure that everything works well for those younger generations as well, because if we don't invest today in all of those different policies, then this is also going to impact the health of the population and so on and so forth. So it is also something that is difficult on a political level. And the committee, the first committee that was set up, and we can't say that it is gauchist or left-wing. We think that we need to take into account the COVID situation, the energy challenges as well, and we have to make sure that we develop those challenges with regard to climate change, but then we should also invest in infrastructure, in training as well. We also talked about this, training of the workers and so on and so forth. So today I'm not going to tell you that Vivaldo is going to make investments. We still have 2 years to do, but investments are necessary for transition. And if not, Belgium is not ambitious, and there is coherence that is necessary.
J'allais ajouter quelque chose, mais c'est trop politicienne, donc je vais...
So keep my political comments for myself, and if you want, we can talk about this in private. Okay, so in fact, we will bring you a microphone because the other microphone has a bad sound. Okay, thank you very much. Noël de Coq, Interenvironnement Wallonie. I wanted perhaps... I wanted to react to the transversality that you have underlined, Madam Minister. The stake is important, but it is not really at the heart of the just transition. The most important thing of the just transition is to integrate in our economies the social vision, the fact that the Earth is round. So this means that the resources are finite, the pollution and emissions are finite. So we are faced to the question of how can we divide a finite pie. So sometimes you have conflicts between topics, between the social dimension, environmental dimension, and so forth. But these conflicts flow forward from the fact that the various social groups want to have the same share of the pie. It's not a conflict between the protection of environment and the planet and the social dimension. It's more a conflict between the understanding whereby the pie can always increase, that growth is important, but growth has disappeared. It diminishes. It has diminished for the last 40 years, despite the technological advancements and the political measures taken. So growth is disappearing. So how are we going to divide this finite pie up between the various social groups? So it is a very noble political question, and we invite you really to address these difficult questions flowing forward from this. So we are already in a rationing economy. Today, rationing is being done through the means of people. You have people who cannot heat themselves, cannot travel. There are other ways to envisage the redistribution of that pie on a more equitable basis, and I believe that these questions have to be addressed in your work as well, next to establishing a more efficiency, more transversality. But as far as we are concerned, this is not at the heart of the problem. So before letting our speakers respond, it is important for us that as many people as possible take the floor. So I have this bad role now in addressing this, and I would like to invite you to be please brief in your intervention so that we can have more people able to ask their questions. So I suppose that we are also invited to answer this question. So I wouldn't say that we totally agree with you, but I don't think you had to understand my presentation also in light of what has been presented before, where we expected that a number of graphs would be showing the links between both topics. So you had environmental limits, the finitude of the resources, and we have to organize ourselves with regard to the finite character of a number of resources. In the sociological literature, we often talk about the power struggle around these topics. I believe that the disciplinary approach and multidisciplinary approach around this topic will be greatly interesting. When I talk about the various definitions, various approaches, I'm specifically talking about that. If we look at the efforts of classification of the various definitions, one of the ways of classifying these, ordering these, is in light of the conception of the place of the market economy or capitalism in just transition, and how we can articulate these processes of post-green growth, post-growth. We are aware of this fact. I'm looking at my colleagues of the ULB who have worked greatly on post-growth theory. Again, I don't think that we will be able to organize all the workers of the committee 100% participative, but we will encourage exchanges and questioning, certainly at the beginning of our workings of our work. Mrs. Minister, I believe, I am convinced it is not only to be more efficient, but when we talk, we ask a Minister of Climate to reach goals, while the Minister of Finances continues to orient the investment choices of the state towards things that emit more greenhouse gases. So we have an unproductive cooperation. So at the same time, my colleague of social affairs has to deal with the problems of social inequality and social struggle with regard to energy prices. So we have to take into account the sustainable development goals, and this is why the systemic approach of the SDGs puts the environment question on the same level as the social dimension. So I feel that I have to be involved in what my Minister of Social Affairs does, my Minister of Finances does. So we have to avoid the silo approach. So it is fundamental. We cannot continue also to plead for ambitious emission goals and continue to defend at the same time a linear economy. So this is something that we have to solve. Thank you very much. Good morning, Melanie Joseph, Interfederal Service for the Struggle Against Social Exclusion and Poverty. We talked about a number of concrete solutions this morning with regard to solar installation of buildings, and then also measures with regard to retention of rainwater in houses. So I have questions about housing with regard to public policy. We have a great problem with regard to the fact that these investments have to be done by the owners for economic benefit for the people renting those places. So how can we encourage owners to invest in changes in their houses that would be for the benefit of the people living there, and a lot of that we would give the opportunities to as well the tenants as the owners to invest in those measures. Thank you very much. So first of all, housing is a regional competence, but in answering your question, I believe I might have the feeling to offer solutions before the process even started. So that wasn't the goal of today. So, but I think I can answer your question indirectly. So the energy crisis we are having today makes that we are confronted with a very steep increase in prices, which makes investment in insulation and housing very sensible. The various governments of this country believe that we should invest greatly, whether it be in the struggle against poverty or the struggle against climate change. We will never be able to do enough investments. Nothing is enough to solve the problem. And then we have the issue of the carbon tax that is being discussed on the European level. So our position states that all the fruits of a green policy on the European level have to go back to the countries, and the countries have to redistribute these fruits of the tax, carbon tax, to their companies and their citizens. So there's a redistributive character linked to this with regard to the European taxation, and this can all be used to direct, indirect support for instance, renovation of houses and so forth. And so we would like to link this to the European fiscal policy that the Commission would like to introduce, and we want to make sure that this money flows back to the households and the companies who would be the end beneficiaries of this policy. Thank you very much. We have a number of questions that were asked by people who follow the streaming. A question of Larry, who says that as organizing company for the International Conference of a Just Transition, Belgium should give the right example. So what type of example could we set? So the dynamic that we are launching really wants to develop a number of proposals on the topic. So I wouldn't want to anticipate the work of the High Committee, the Agora, or the citizen meeting. So I would like to invite you to follow the work. So we invite Larry to follow our work very closely. Second question. What do you think of the integration of the young people in this political process with regard to the revitalization of the climate policies in our country? So here's a question addressed to all three of you. First of all, we have to acknowledge the role that the youth climate marches have had. I was chairwoman of my party, and I have the humility that part of this victory stems from that youth movement. And secondly, the young people will have their place in this debate in the Agora, the Citizen Forum, and it is not my generation which will carry the hopes for the future. My generation was also green. I believe that the new generations can integrate the stakes of the transition easily. So today we have business as usual, and complementary we think, okay, we should do something. But the new generations, I have the feeling that they will not have that approach. They will only see the world through this stake, this important topic. So we are still linked too greatly to the old world. And I believe the younger generations will not be linked to the old world. So, okay, I believe that now we will conclude the interventions for today.
But yet the mission is not impossible, I believe, for all of us. We need to trust into the future. We need to trust into the process that presented today au travers de la ministre Zakia Khattabi et de son équipe.
Through the work of Minister Khattabi and her team. Before concluding this meeting, I would like to say that this is not the end of the discussion today. The discussion continues. And for more information, we refer you to the website. If you would like to have more information, you can go on the website of the Minister, www.khattabi.be, but also info@khattabi.fed.be and developmentdurable.be. I would like to thank Minister Khattabi for her courage and also her team. I would like to thank Vice Prime Minister Georges Elkiné, who has honored us with his presence. I would like to thank the various speakers of the various professors who have taken the time to show us a number of possible solutions. I would like to thank the trade unions for their initial reflections on just transition. I would like to thank the various NGOs, the directors of the various administrations present in the room, and I would like to thank you for the various different questions. I would like to invite you to continue this reflection and this dialogue beyond this meeting. So after these concluding remarks, I would like to invite you to lunch.
Thank you.